Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for tonight's Preservation School class about the New York City's Department of Design and Construction. We have another Preservation School class preserving the art of stone carving on April 24th, as well as virtual and in-person Six to Celebrate and conference tours and programs coming up over the next few months. Information about all our upcoming programming can be found on our website, hdc.org. If you have questions about programming, you can contact me at marbulu@hdc.org. Tonight's class will be recorded and posted to our YouTube channel for free viewing. You may also watch all of our previous Preservation School classes, virtual tours, and conference panels on our YouTube channel. I would like to thank the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, City Council, and the New York State Council of the Arts for supporting Preservation School. If you have any questions, you can add them to the chat and Jeremy will address them at the end. Now, I'll hand it over to Jeremy Woodoff to lead tonight's class. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle, and thank you all for joining Preservation School this evening. I retired about 18 months ago from the Department of Design and Construction, where I worked for 23 years. And before that, I spent 20 years working at the Landmarks Preservation Commission in various roles, including in the Preservation Department, where much of my time was spent in working on reviewing projects in the public sector. So I've been doing this for a very long time. I think a couple of my former coworkers have joined the class, and at the end, if I have made any significant errors or if anything new has happened that I don't know about, I would certainly welcome your commentary on that. This class is about historic public works in New York City and how they are affected by today's public works agency, the Department of Design and Construction. Public works can be transformative for a city. The creation of the Croton water system is one example. This manhole cover for the system displays the initials DPW, for Department of Public Works. This name was used at various times for the city agency that undertakes these projects. It's a simple yet evocative name for a very important government function. Let me see, my slide advance is not working.
It was working before.
Yes.
Maybe click the screen.
Let's see. There we go. Okay, let's see. Yes, all right, thank you. Indeed, the Croton Water Project was so important that 20 years after its completion, it was still being celebrated in another public work, Emma Stebbins' Angel of the Waters in Central Park. But we are going to focus on much more recent history and current practices, albeit practices that can have great impacts on the important and now historic works of the past. We start with the creation of the Department of Design and Construction in 1996, during the administration of Mayor Rudy Giuliani. DDC is a super agency formed by merging the Capital Projects Department of several other agencies, the Department of Transportation, Department of Environmental Protection, Department of General Services, which was then renamed DCAS, the Department of Citywide Administrative Services. More recently, parts of the Department of Parks and Recreation's capital work were added. These agencies maintain their operational activities funded by the city's annual expense budget. In some cases, they also maintain their own reduced capital projects departments to undertake small projects. The pictures accompanying the following slides provide glimpses of the range of projects that DDC undertakes for these agencies. The illustrated projects all affect historic structures or sites, some of which are designated landmarks and some of which are not. DDC's Historic Preservation Office is involved in all these projects and will be described in more detail later. I'll be referring to the office as HPO, and when I say we, I'm generally referring to HPO and sometimes to myself, even though I no longer work there. These are the types of work DDC does for the Department of Transportation. Street and highway reconstruction, sidewalks, and this is an example of a sidewalk project at Snug Harbor in Staten Island. It happened to be one of the largest intact stretches of bluestone sidewalk in the city, about 2/3 of a mile. And unfortunately, DDC replaced it all with concrete a few years ago, despite the fact that it's adjacent to the designated landmark fence at Snug Harbor. Usually sidewalks are done by the adjacent property owners, but for city-owned projects, DDC undertakes the work for the Department of Transportation. Pedestrian crossing ramps. These materials and designs are the typical treatment for historic districts. Street and park lighting. I don't know if this little box is in the way, but I'll try to reduce it. Street and park lighting, which includes reproductions of several styles of historic street lights. Traffic signs and signals. Public plazas built on street rights of way. And bridges. For the Department of Environmental Protection, we undertake work on sewers, storm, sanitary, and combined, wastewater treatment, water supply, and sustainability initiatives such as curbside green infrastructure. Most DE projects concern underground utilities, but these projects sometimes have historic preservation implications. There was a need to increase the outfall capacity of a storm sewer at the abutment of the landmark Carroll Street Bridge, where the sewer empties into the Gowanus Canal. The double outfall and the stone wall were rebuilt in kind to match the original. At Washington Square Park South, near a known burial ground, DEP had to hire archaeologists, or we hired the archaeologists for DEP, to investigate the site, which was affected by underground excavation for either water or sewer lines. There are above-ground manifestations of utility work. We ensure that historic-style hydrants and bollard caps are used in historic districts. And the recent introduction of sustainability initiatives, such as curbside green infrastructure, can affect historic paving materials. Projects from the former Department of General Services, now DCAS, encompass most of the historic buildings owned by the city. DGS once was the capital project agency for a host of other client city agencies. Capital projects for all those agencies, as well as those for buildings for which DCAS itself is the client, are now run by DDC. And so we have buildings in the 3 library systems, New York, Brooklyn, and Queensboro libraries. The fire department. This is a decommissioned firehouse. The police department. Department of Cultural Affairs. Here are 3 different cultural institutions adjacent to each other: La Mama Theater, Choice Cerciati Theater, and the Rod Rogers Dance Company, all on East 4th Street in the Lower East Side, East Village Historic District. Civic buildings such as city and borough halls, courthouses, and municipal office buildings. This is the Appellate Division Courthouse in the Brooklyn Heights Historic District. Most people have never seen its spectacular, intact, modern classical interior. The Historic Preservation Office prepared an illustrated description and appreciation of the building to help its court administrators fend off proposals for inappropriate work on the interior and the exterior. There's a Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, which has a number of very significant WPA and mid-century health centers throughout the city. Department of Corrections. DDC is fully engaged in the proposal to close Rikers Island and build borough-based jails. This work doesn't typically involve historic preservation. That is, unless in beginning to dismantle the current modern jail at 100 Center Street, you discover in a niche inside the building a cornerstone dated 1796. Alerted to this find by DDC, the LPC's archaeologist, Amanda Sutphin, worked to ensure the proper handling and preservation of this stone. It was determined that it came from New York State's first prison, eventually called Newgate after the famous London jail. The prison was on the Hudson River near Greenwich Village. The cornerstone has apparently been carried from prison to prison for 200 years. Department of Sanitation facilities don't usually present historic preservation issues, but it happens that sanitation has jurisdiction over the former Colored School number 4 in Chelsea, recently designated by the Landmarks Commission and funded now for restoration. The Department of Homeless Services, here in a former hospital complex, Administration for Children's Services in the former Bellevue Hospital, and also buildings for the Department of Transportation. Projects that DDC runs for the Parks Department are limited to work on existing or proposed new buildings under Parks jurisdiction. A recent example is this wood shingle roof replacement at the designated Kingsland Homestead in Queens. DDC designed this work in-house, a bit of a challenge as none of our architects had experience in designing and specifying wood roofs, and the contractor had only modest experience. The problem of getting good contractors for historic preservation work is ongoing. Most of these small firms are not interested in navigating the administrative nightmare that is the city's contracting process. An ongoing project for parks is construction of a new maintenance, operations building and service yard on the site of the picnic grounds at Orchard Beach. The site isn't a landmark, but it's close to the landmarked Orchard Beach Pavilion and Promenade. This is a test case for the new design-build process, in which a single contractor is hired to take the project through both design and construction phases. This is supposed to be quicker and more efficient, and puts the risk of delays and overruns on the contractor rather than the city. There is some concern that this process isn't well suited to public projects that have many constituent stakeholders and peripheral concerns. There's also the danger that those concerned with preservation issues will find themselves further from decision-making. The former Adams Chewing Gum Factory in Long Island City, Queens, has been home to DDC since its inception in 1996. Unlike Jack Lemon's huge insurance firm in the apartment, at DDC it isn't necessary to enhance the perspective by making desks smaller in the background. DDC is an enormous organization. In fiscal year 23, it had a staff of about 1,100, down during the pandemic, but expected to grow to about 1,300. It completed $2.2 billion worth of capital projects in that year, 101 project designs, and 75 construction projects. Just for comparison, the other agency we're discussing today, the Landmarks Preservation Commission, has 78 employees, 28 of them are in the Preservation Department, and they issued 11,500 permits in fiscal year 23. Most of those, of course, for private owners and not for city projects. That's 2 to 2.5 permits per workday each. It's an impossible workload. Organization-wise, DDC has two main divisions, infrastructure and public buildings. Infrastructure clients are the Department of Transportation and Department of Environmental Protection. Public buildings clients are all those other agencies we've been discussing. Other components of the agency are shown here. For our purposes, I'll be discussing mostly the architecture and engineering unit in more detail, and we'll touch on design excellence. The A&E unit has several functions. It works with the agencies and the DDC program units to finalize project scopes. It meets with the team members as projects are being designed projects are being designed, and it reviews design submissions for conformance to codes and best practices. It occasionally undertook in-house designs for small projects. At one time, the director of the architecture and engineering unit had to approve each formal design submission before the project could proceed. That hasn't been the case in a long time, and the result has been a diffusion of decision-making and responsibility. One result of this was the fiasco of the new Hunters Point Branch Library by Stephen Hull, which was so far from meeting ADA requirements, that is Americans with Disabilities Act, that the Justice Department sued the city and the city sued the architect. A&E had warned of these problems during design, to no avail. The Historic Preservation Office got its start in 1988 at the Department of General Services under Adrian Bresnan. The office moved with DDC to DDC when it was formed in 1996. At that time, there was a staff of 6 working under an assistant commissioner for historic preservation. If you were to think that the current staffing in the Historic Preservation Office reflects a loss of historic preservation's influence within the city's public works structure, you would be correct. In earlier times, with its bigger staff, the office prepared studies such as for city-owned historic buildings that were looking for new uses, and compilations of the Carnegie libraries and historic fire and courthouses. It sponsored lectures and exhibits. Today, with its reduced staffing and lack of management level leadership, the responsibilities of the HPO are reduced and mirror those of the other reviewers in architecture and engineering, but of course, with a particular focus on historic preservation. So the Historic Preservation Office today works with agency staff and consultants to bring a historic preservation perspective to capital projects affecting designated landmarks and landmark quality buildings and sites. It develops historic preservation scopes of work, and those can be both for preservation projects and for non-preservation projects that affect historic buildings. For instance, installation of a new HVAC system in a historic building. It reviews design submissions from consultants and occasionally from in-house designers. It prepares and submits applications to the Landmarks Preservation Commission, monitors construction, and applies to landmarks for sign-offs on completed work. It occasionally still undertakes historic preservation studies to help inform early stages of design. But the focus today is on reviewing consultant submissions and submitting applications to the Landmarks Commission. I mentioned landmark quality buildings. This is a designation that originated at DGS when it was recognized that many of the city's historic buildings are not designated landmarks. It was, and still is, a way to try to ensure that historic preservation considerations apply to these buildings as well as designated landmarks. In the 1990s, the Historic Preservation Office estimated that of the 1,500 buildings for which DGS had jurisdiction for capital projects, 10% were designated landmarks, or about 150, and an additional 40%, or about 600, were of landmark quality. These are 2 examples of landmark quality buildings, and 2 more. We never shied away from including modern buildings if we thought they had some architectural significance or quality. HPO always tries to ensure appropriate treatment of historic interiors for both landmark and landmark quality buildings, even though very few historic interiors are designated landmarks. After 23 years with DDC, my assessment of the city's capital project process is best reflected by this diagram. But at least I can clarify the process at DDC, or try to, in 6 relatively easy steps. But before going into those, I want to give you a definition. DDC works only on capital projects, which always involve construction. These are paid for in the future through the issuance of municipal bonds. On the other hand, agency operations are paid for by the annual expense budget that's funded through yearly city revenues. In the 1960s and 70s, as tax revenues declined, the city began funding operations with bonds. The resulting fiscal crisis led to rules prohibiting the use of capital or bond monies for operating expenses. including for ordinary maintenance of public facilities. While perhaps prudent fiscally, the restriction has had severely negative effects on many historic buildings, as I'll explain later. The first step in the process at DDC is that a client comes to the agency to request that we undertake a project for them. That would be the design and construction of the project. They bring money that's been allocated to them for the project in the upcoming fiscal year's capital budget. These funds are allocated from some combination of the mayor, the city council, borough president, or individual council member. Once the project comes into the agency, it undergoes scope verification. This is done by a unit called front-end planning. Client agencies are often vague about the scope of their projects, and the funds they've acquired are often insufficient for what they want to do. And sometimes we determine that additional work is required that they haven't considered. Smaller institutions like historic houses, museums, and cultural centers often get their funding by going begging to council members. If the funds they get are insufficient, as they often are, they have to put the project on hold until the next funding cycle. So front-end planning scope verification purpose is to make sure that the scope is properly identified and that all necessary elements are included, and that the funding is adequate to undertake the project. Front-end planning is a fairly recent unit at DDC. It can take up to a year to determine whether a project is ready for initiation, a year that isn't counted in DDC's scheduling because the project technically hasn't been officially initiated. Front-end planning has no preservationists on its staff and has significantly usurped the Historic Preservation Office's role in determining project scope. Once FEP has signed off on project initiation, the project is assigned a design project manager from the appropriate program unit. So that would, for instance, be someone from the libraries unit or the culturals unit or the parks unit, as an example. A design review team from the architecture and engineering unit is formed, consisting of architects, engineers from various disciplines, landscape architects, and so on, as required for the project. And a design consultant is selected. Traditionally, there were three ways of selecting a design consultant: by request for proposals, or RFP. That was once more common, but is now very rare because it requires a great deal of time. Usually what's done is an on-call consultant is selected. These are consultants that have multi-year contracts with the city for design work, usually based on a cost range of the project. So there might be 3 consultants for large projects, 4 or 5 for medium projects, and so on. And they're selected either through rotations or by putting in small proposals for a particular project. Until recently, there were also specialty design consultants on board. So there were a few for historic preservation, for landscape, for mechanical, electrical, and plumbing projects. That process has been changed, and now all design consultants will be led by an architect, and if necessary, they will hire sub-consultants. This process has its problems because, in my experience, in, for instance, historic preservation, the architect prime consultant will be happy to consult the preservation architect on technical matters, but not on design issues. And in preservation, there are often major design issues, such as how to approach an addition to a building, which really aren't technical in nature, but they're design in nature. And the architect consultants are generally loath to give up that prerogative to someone else. Once the actual work on design begins, there are 3 what we call milestones, and each one is accompanied by a submission of drawings and specifications. There's schematic design, design development, and construction documents or final design. Projects get reviewed from outside the agency at various times. Outside review agencies include the community boards, the Public Design Commission, and the Landmarks Preservation Commission. Community boards, I believe, review all projects that have to go to public hearings at those other commissions and possibly also other projects that significantly affect their geographic area. The Public Design Commission reviews all projects that don't affect individual landmarks or historic districts. That means they review projects affecting landmark quality buildings. They also review all artworks and most work in scenic landmarks. The Landmarks Preservation Commission reviews all projects affecting individual and scenic landmarks, historic districts, and artworks, although only for placement and scale. There are a few instances in which both agencies review the same project. At one time, for all public projects affecting landmarks, scenic landmarks, and historic districts, both agencies reviewed all those projects. But now the dual reviews are limited to landscapes and new buildings in scenic landmarks and works of art. Once a project is through the design phase, it goes into the construction phase. Most projects are advertised for public bidding, and the lowest qualified bidder is awarded the contract. That process actually takes a long time. I think it's around a year at least from the time the final submission of design drawings is submitted until the project actually goes out to bid. And because of that length of time, the agency has developed a process called the Job Order Contracting System, or JOCS. It would take me a full hour just to talk about this particular aspect of the agency, but I'll try to say quickly that what JOCS does is it's a series of contractors, one for each borough, that is essentially on call. So these are contractors that will work on projects in the relevant borough based on a price book that they have. And that price book covers many what are supposed to be standard projects. For instance, resurfacing a parking lot, building a concrete stair, and the prices could be based on, per linear foot or per square yard. Basic projects that are done every day and that don't require a lot of design work. And they can be done immediately because there's no need for the whole bidding process. The problem is that many projects, perhaps most projects, I'm not sure, don't exactly fit what's in the contractor's price book. And what happens then is the city will begin negotiating with the JOCS contractor. And the city is at a real disadvantage because either the city has to accept the price that the contractor gives us, or we have to stop the project and spend a year or more going through the standard contract and bidding process. So this was most recently used, in my experience, with the stabilization of the abolitionist house at 227 Duffield Street in downtown Brooklyn. All I can say is that the project turned out to be remarkably expensive and not that quick. Although in fairness, I have to say that many years ago, a historic preservation project was carried out through the JOCS system, in which the JOCS contractor had a very qualified preservationist subcontractor on the job. But it is a problematic process overall. And now, to borrow the title of the recent HDC Preservation Conference, I'm going to present in more detail a few DDC projects illustrating the good, the bad, and the ugly. We start naturally with civic virtue. This sculptural group in front of City Hall was a late work of Frederick McMonnies. It was designed in 1909, but not installed until 1922, due in part to some problems with the Art Commission, which is what the Public Design Commission was called back then. This was shortly after the 19th Amendment for women's suffrage was adopted. The iconography of the sculpture was said not to have been well received, with the male figure of civic virtue standing over, if not actually stomping on, two prone female figures representing vice. McMonnies had some choice words about the controversy, which I can't repeat, but you can find them online. In fact, there has been a remarkable amount of newspaper coverage of this sculpture over the last 100 years. 20 years later, Mayor LaGuardia had enough. The sculpture, you'll notice, has a definite front and back, and the mayor didn't like looking at the backside every time he left City Hall. After an earlier failed attempt to move it to Foley Square, the fountain was moved to the brand new Queensborough Hall in Kew Gardens. This picture shows the immense below-ground chamber that holds all the plumbing. You can still enter and walk below grade the full circumference of the fountain basin. We found no evidence that the water was ever turned on. In 2012, Borough President Helen Marshall found she didn't like the iconography either. After a rally at the site held by, of all people, then Congressman Anthony Weiner, the sculptural group was picked up off the fountain and moved to Greenwood Cemetery, where it remains today. The remainder of the fountain quickly deteriorated, and the next borough president, Melinda Katz, decided she wanted it fixed up, planted, and turned into a garden in honor of the women of Queens. DDC was given this task, but we determined that conditions were well beyond a quick fix-up. The Historic Preservation Office and A&E staff landscape architect designed the stone and landscape restoration in-house and kept a close eye on the contractor, who wasn't overly familiar with this type of work. "70 Mulberry Street is the former PS 23, an early 1892 design by CBJ Snyder. It was home to many social service organizations and the Museum of Chinese in America when a fire damaged it in 2020. The structural engineer's report after the fire noted that besides the 5th floor, which was an addition, there was little structural damage. And this shows the building in its original form on the left and with the 5th floor addition on the right before the fire. But the Department of Citywide Administrative Services, which had jurisdiction over the building, wanted the building gone and proceeded to have it demolished floor by floor. Eventually, community outrage stopped the demolition at the 2nd floor. DDC then initiated a project to reconstruct the building. The building isn't a local landmark, but is within a National Register historic district and was obviously of landmark quality. I should point out that in that stair tower on the corner, which you can see here on the right, was this wonderful original ironwork going all the way up. Our first skirmish was against our own architecture and engineering team members. We successfully pushed back against their proposal to continue the demolition, as they claimed the building didn't meet code or have adequate ADA access, and the stair tower, which remained intact and was in fact undamaged by the fire, would collapse should there be an earthquake. HPO suggested looking at the rebuilding of the designated Foreign Exchange Bank in Harlem for inspiration. The bank had even less of its historic facade remaining. Yet it was rebuilt to an almost exact replica of its original design. However, what we're getting instead is a design from Grimshaw Architects, approved, likely with enthusiasm, by the Public Design Commission. It appears even the wonderful ironwork in the stair tower is being stripped out. The Brownsville Branch Library is a small 1908 Carnegie branch designed by Lord and Hewlett. It's one of the few old buildings left in a neighborhood thoroughly remade by demolitions and urban renewal. The building is not a designated landmark, but is of landmark quality. Brooklyn Public Library wants to construct an addition and stair towers and other interior upgrades. HPO encouraged the architects to make the additions harmonious and unobtrusive. The initial design, while very modern, made efforts to respect the historic building's form and details, and kept the rooftop addition pulled back from the facade as far as possible. This proposal was brought to the Public Design Commission by our Design Excellence team, without benefit of anyone who could explain the reasons behind the design and the desire to respect the historic building. PDC's reaction was that the addition should, quote, confront the historic building. So the architects eliminated the details that helped to architecturally tie the stair towers into the existing building and pushed the rooftop addition forward. PDC liked the revision and gave the project a design award. The landmark quality Elmhurst Branch Carnegie Library in Queens was built in 1906 and was also designed by Lord and Hewlett. It required a rather large addition, and while the design that was proposed would have demolished an earlier conforming addition, much of the original library would have remained. This proposal was the subject of a peer review by outside reviewers, an initiative that for a while was part of the Design Excellence Program at DDC. The Design Excellence Program was an attempt to ensure that quality architectural design had at least equal footing with schedule and budget concerns. As a result of this peer review, DDC's commissioner at the time decided, instead of trying to fit an addition on the site, we should just start over. So the historic Elmhurst Carnegie was demolished, and we got a brand new library. This is an example, actually the last two, are examples of a case in which, if the city followed its own environmental law, the City Environmental Quality Review Act, a different outcome might have been possible. There is better news in Brooklyn. The individually designated Park Slope Branch Library, near the Park Slope Historic District, is one of the more elaborate Brooklyn Carnegies, designed in 1906 by Raymond Almirall. Following a public hearing, LPC approved a proposal for access improvements. A sensitive design by the architect, Vince Bennick, was fortuitously enabled by the characteristics of the building and site. A new sloped walk traverses the site from the side to enter a new doorway cut into the building's vestibule. This allows universal entry into the same space while having no effect on the main architectural entrance and steps. An elevator and accessible restrooms were installed in the interior with minimal disruption. But construction was slow, and after about 2 years, when it was almost complete, the library looked around and said they couldn't possibly reopen given the conditions in the building. It had been bad before construction started, with the library having been neglected for decades. It was worse now following the construction. The chestnut paneling had areas of rot and mismatched replacements and had been coated with many layers of varnish, some of which had turned a sickly greenish color. Because the children's and adults' reading rooms had been switched, the shelves in the adults' room covered the lower part of the paneling, and in the children's room, it left a gap between the shelves and the paneling. Exposed conduit ran over the walls. Unpleasant high-intensity discharge lights lit the reading rooms. The book stacks had industrial lighting and had been painted battleship gray. The 4 Gruby tile fireplaces were filthy. This one had actually been covered over. This branch is remarkable in retaining 2 of its original 3 leaded opalescent glass ley lights. Most or all of the Brooklyn Carnegie branches had decorative ley lights. These are the only ones that remain. The skylights above were long closed, and there were no working artificial lights above the ley lights. That and years of dust and grime left them looking like dark holes in the ceiling. The library couldn't afford to wait years for new design and construction contracts for interior work. So we set about designing the interior restoration in-house with a full team composed of members of the Architecture and Engineering Unit, including the Historic Preservation Office. Our DDC construction project manager, to our great good fortune, had been a high-end cabinet maker in his earlier career. The project was designed as it was being built through a series of change orders to the contractor who was finishing up the ADA work. All the woodwork was stripped, repaired, and refinished. Experts in stained glass restoration and conservators for the Gruby tile fireplaces were brought in. Custom wood shelves and cabinets were fashioned. The lighting was changed and long missing wall sconces reinstituted. We discovered, this is one of the fireplaces in its restored condition. We discovered original mirrored glass fixtures above the ley lights, inspiring installation of new LED theatrical spotlights to illuminate from above the two restored ley lights. The original flooring, glass flooring in the book stacks, long hidden beneath paint and vinyl tiles, was revealed. After much calculating and angst among our engineers, the old glass was replaced with high-strength glass needed to support the weight of an occupied motorized wheelchair, now that the mezzanine level was accessible by the new elevator. The battleship gray paint was stripped and the original bronze finish on the supports was exposed. We even found bits of the original linoleum floor covering hidden under moldings. One of the few disappointments was not getting the library to agree to install the very close available match, seen at the top of the picture. Because we had done so much investigation, both documentary and on-site, for this project, we took the opportunity to prepare a historic structure report for the library. I believe this is the only such report that has been produced under DDC's auspices. It's certainly the only one done in-house. The project won an award from the Victorian Society. Another Brooklyn library, the Macon branch, was due for a window replacement and other work. Designed in 1907 by Richard A. Walker, it's located in what was then a proposed historic district in Bedford-Stuyvesant. This meant that both the Landmarks Commission and Public Design Commission reviewed the proposed work. This branch, as did many of the Brooklyn and Queens Carnegies, originally had large, single-light pivoting windows. They've all disappeared. At the Macon branch, they had been replaced first by multi-light double-hung wood windows, and then by similar aluminum windows. We asked the design consultant to see if wood, single-light but double-glazed, pivoting windows could be manufactured to fit the existing historic openings. He was able to do it, and the library agreed. This is now the only Brooklyn Carnegie that has architecturally correct wood pivoting windows. Moving on to an infrastructure project, Bogardus Garden is a triangle of former street bed in the Tribeca Historic District. The name was bestowed by the late Margot Gale, a preservationist who helped found, among other organizations, Friends of Cast Iron Architecture. It honors the pioneering work of James Bogardus in the development of cast iron building facades. A few of Bogardus's buildings remain in the area. In the mid-century, a raised island with some trees helped to channel traffic. Temporary artwork was added later. The island was eventually fenced and given more decorative plantings. A construction project closed the western Hudson Street roadbed, seen in the plan on the left, for a staging area. And when the construction was over, a local group proposed leaving the block closed to traffic and adding temporary chairs and tables and having events outdoors. The experiment was successful, and DOT agreed to work with the Friends of Bogardus Garden to create a permanent pedestrian plaza. As the area is within a historic district, DDC brought the proposed design to the Landmarks Commission, which approved it. The design uses some traditional park furniture and pavements, but because the site wasn't a historic park, the designer also proposed some more contemporary features that are still harmonious with the district's historic character. In cities like Rome, when excavation occurs, there are often delays due to encounters with 2,000-year-old archaeological remains. In New York, when excavation occurs, there are often delays due to encounters with old infrastructure of unknown age and utility. That was certainly the case with this project, which was delayed for a couple of years by this, but it was finally completed about 2 years ago. One of the Bogardus Garden friends wanted to donate a sidewalk post clock to the plaza to commemorate a long-gone clock that was on the building fronting the north side of the triangle, seen here in the background. DDC's horology division, that's me, suggested finding a restored cast iron historic post clock instead of an off-the-shelf aluminum reproduction. That was done, and East Lansing's loss is our gain. There are half a dozen or so historic sidewalk post blocks in the city, all of which are designated individual landmarks. This is the only one with an original mechanical movement, rather than a modern electric movement. When the door is open for its weekly winding, there is often great public interest. Next, we look at another infrastructure project, this one actually an amalgam of two projects. They are the reconstruction of streets in the Gansevoort Market Historic District and in the Dumbo and Vinegar Hill Historic Districts in Brooklyn. Both project areas had significant amounts of historic paving materials and other features. Both were to have new pedestrian plazas built in what had been the street beds, and both went to extraordinary lengths to preserve both historic materials and historic character. Doing this is challenging when everything has to be ripped up to replace underground utilities and when accessibility standards must be met. Some of the historic features of these districts included railroad tracks in Dumbo from the old J Street connecting railroad, historic stone crosswalks, manhole covers of the Manhattan Refrigerating Company, which supplied refrigeration to the Gansevoort district's cold storage warehouses. Many sidewalks in Dumbo were either non-existent or consisted of impassable cobblestones. The pedestrian plazas had been set up temporarily and were now proposed to be made permanent. This is the one in Dumbo near the anchorage for the Manhattan Bridge. And this is one of two in the Gansevoort district. The plans that were developed were remarkably detailed for street reconstruction projects, done actually mostly by a landscape architect in DDC's infrastructure division. Drawings of individual sidewalks and crosswalks were made, showing how granite slabs, cobblestones, railroad tracks, and other materials would be incorporated into unique situations. Mock-ups were made for different colors and finishes of paving stones, depending on where they were to be used and whether they had to be accessible. At the contractor's yard for the Dumbo project, salvaged railroad tracks were laid out and granite blocks were piled into mountains, each labeled with the street they had come from, so they could be returned to the correct place. Here, salvaged 19th century crosswalk pavers are set out for incorporation into the new crosswalks. And in Gansevoort, the manhole covers of the Manhattan Refrigerating Company had been reset as documentation of the district's history. Here are some pictures of completed portions of the work. I will close with 6 recommendations for improving the integration of historic preservation into the city's capital program. Each of these would be a significant challenge to undertake, and accomplishing any of them would be a major victory. First, we should institute real capital planning in the city. It should be undertaken using professionally based needs assessments and fair and consistent criteria, with less reliance on the whims of elected officials whose interests come and go, and less dependence on the political lobbying abilities of agencies and organizations. We should provide adequate expense budgets for maintenance so that historic buildings don't undergo continuing cycles of restoration followed by neglect and deterioration. This results in a poor image for the city and the loss of historic fabric. Office of Management and Budget Rules, known as Directive 10, should be modified for historic buildings. These rules require a minimum dollar amount and minimum percentage replacements of materials in order to be considered eligible for capital funding. This has the effect of requiring removal of historic material to make the project eligible, a perverse effect. The objective should be to retain historic material while returning the building to good condition and extending its life expectancy. The building pictured is one of the 4 historic houses in Weeksville. And this is a project that hasn't yet gone into construction, having been at DDC for over 7 years. part of that delay, not all of it, but actually a good part of it, had to do with going back and forth with OMB on what was eligible and what was not eligible while the buildings continued to deteriorate. We should fully implement the City Environmental Quality Review Act's provisions requiring environmental review of capital projects affecting historic resources, especially those not protected by landmark designation. These are two of many buildings on Hart Island, which DDC recently demolished. Unfortunately, there was no full seeker review that would have determined which buildings were historic and architecturally significant, and what alternatives there might have been to full-scale demolition. We should change procedures and develop programs to encourage preservation-oriented contractors to bid on city work. And we should recognize that the city is steward for an enormous number of historic properties, representing significant past public investment. We should provide sufficient historic preservation resources, both within DDC and in the agencies that initiate capital projects, to make sure preservation considerations always have a place at the table. Thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Jeremy. If anyone has any questions, you can put it in the chat, or if you'd like, you can raise your hand. I think we have one. Oh, now just David, you raise your hand. Yeah, you can unmute yourself.
Yes, hi, good evening. My name is Dave Rosas. I'm with a group called Friends of Marshall Parkland on the northwest side of the Bronx. My question is regarding when you mention the steps 4 and 6. It would seem to be that the vehicles being used is some type of indefinite delivery or indefinite quantity contract. Is that more or less what's in place, so that you don't have to do the RFP process necessarily?
Are you talking about the construction process?
Well, I guess on the design as well too. You said that you guys are not really putting out RFP, but
Oh, yes.
so
Yeah.
something short of that, and something's already in place, I guess, like what I mentioned, an IDIQ contract, if you will.
Well, there are design consultants who are under city contract for a multi-year period, and if we get a project in-house for, say, a new building or restoration of an existing building, we would typically go to one of those contractors already on board based on the size of the project, and just have him start work, have that contractor start work. We wouldn't have to put out a request for hiring a new contractor. Now, if the project were really something unusual that couldn't be handled by one of our onboard contractors, then I guess the agency would still put out a request for proposals.
Understood. Thank you.
Mhm.
Michelle, go ahead.
I have 2 questions. One is, can you explain in detail what is a CEQR provision? What does it entail?
Well, this could be the subject of another hour's talk, but CEQR, City Environmental Quality Review Act, is the city's version of federal and state environmental law. So there's the NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, there's the State Environmental Quality Review Act. And all of those laws come out of the 1970s determination that when government undertakes large-scale projects, it wasn't considering the impacts that those projects might have. And that could be on air quality, on provision of sewer and water services, on noise issues, on traffic, and on historic preservation. So all of those environmental impacts, when a project is proposed, it's supposed to be determined whether it has the potential for having impacts, any of those impacts. So there's an initial process to make that determination. there are some kinds of projects that are so routine, they're considered not to ever have to go through environmental review. But the law, including the city's law, specifically states that a potential adverse environmental impact is a negative impact on historic resources. And any potential adverse impact, whether it's on air quality or traffic or noise or historic resources, is supposed to trigger a full-scale environmental review, which means looking at the impacts in detail, looking to see whether there are any alternatives that would reduce the impacts, or if necessary, just mitigating the impacts. The city follows the law. For instance, if a developer proposes a rezoning and the city's action is a rezoning, the city also will use the act if, for instance, it's selling property, I believe, putting up a major housing project. There are some things that trigger it, but never, to my knowledge, has historic effect on historic resources by itself triggered the city to implement seeker for that project. And I believe the law specifically requires that, but it isn't done.
I'm surprised that the Office of Environmental Remediation, they don't have any input, or they're not triggered by any of these?
Well, do you mean why they're not requiring that seeker be done?
Yeah, because that's their whole purpose as an agency.
Right, well, that's a good question. And I have to say that I once made a fairly significant attempt, I thought, to understand why this wasn't happening, and basically was sent around on a circle from one agency to another, and no one would ever answer the question.
Okay, thank you. And then my second question was, it's interesting that SHIP, they're not involved in any of these as well, in regards it's higher, like at the state level?
The SHPO, the State
Yeah,
Historic
SHPO,
Preservation Office,
exactly.
they're involved if state or federal money or decisions are involved in a project. But most of what DDC is strictly local funding, for instance, and the state does not become involved in those projects.
Okay, thank you. It's a great presentation.
Oh, thank you very much.
Someone commented, nice presentation, Jeremy. Very
Thank you.
interesting to learn about the Queen's Fountain. Great to see you again. I look forward to future talks. That was from Raymond Zabrowski.
Oh yes, Ray was our landscape architect.
Oh, nice.
Recently. Mm-hmm.
Yes,
He's not the one that did that project. That was Lisa Guggenheimer, who retired some time ago, worked on the fountain, civic virtue.
Fountain did look great. And if anyone, I have seen it in person. If anyone has a chance, go see it in person. It's great. I don't see any more questions, and we are at 7 o'clock. So I think we are done. So thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. Once again, we do have a lot of programs coming up, so please do check out our website, hdc.org. And if anyone is not on the mailing list, please email me, and I can add you to our mailing list. And yes, that's it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you all for coming. I appreciate it.
Have a good night.
Hey, thanks, Jeremy.